Today, we're going to learn why eating local seafood doesn't always mean eating sustainable. As part of our Iberostar Wave of Change seafood strategy, we want to be able to offer local, sustainable seafood and believe in finding ways to help local fisheries reach markets in the places where we operate. Finding solutions for small-scale fisheries is immensely important because they produce 2/3 of catches destined for direct human consumption and provide 90% of the employment in the sector. Let's explore some of the challenges and opportunities of small-scale fisheries. It's my pleasure today to introduce a fabulous panel of speakers. My name is Dr. Megan Morikawa. I'm the Global Director of Sustainability at Iberostar Group. And we also have with us today Julie Kuchepatov, former Seafood Director at Fairtrade, Elena Finkbeiner, Coastal Communities Fisheries Program Manager at Conservation International. We have Wendy Goyert, Lead Specialist of Latin American Fisheries in Transition at World Wildlife Fund. We have Felicity Burrows, Caribbean Fisheries Specialist at the Nature Conservancy. And we also have Adriana Sanchez, Iberostar's Responsible Seafood Strategy Director. So I'm excited for us to get into a little bit of a conversation today about what small-scale fisheries are. That's actually going to be our first question. So Elena, if you wanted to start us off on how it is that we define a small-scale fishery, and if you'd be willing, and I know this is a big topic, are all small-scale fisheries sustainable?
Great questions, Megan. So really there's no singular definition of small-scale fishery. It's defined differently by region and by country, but there are some defining characteristics that some people offer, including smaller vessel size, simpler or more traditional gear types, proximity to the coast, smaller crews, family or local ownership, importance for local livelihoods and subsistence, and also that many small-scale fisheries are deeply rooted in community and culture. So relative to the industrial fishing sector, the small-scale sector contributes about half of global fisheries capture. But as Megan just mentioned, about 2/3 of global fisheries capture that is destined for direct human consumption comes from small-scale fisheries. And also, they employ 90% of wild capture fishers and fish workers, half of whom are women. So here you can kind of begin to see how important small-scale fisheries are for food and livelihood security. And to your second question, I would say given the complexity of these fisheries, historical management efforts have often not done enough to achieve sustainability. Overfishing in small-scale fisheries is often tied to issues of poverty, equity, and access. And also small-scale fisheries are becoming increasingly exposed to external stressors, such as climate change, globalization, socioeconomic development, and now the disease pandemic. But despite this, there are some really incredible examples of small-scale fisheries around the world that have engaged in very sophisticated self-governance and co-management arrangements where they're able to safeguard their resources and act as ecosystem stewards.
I think that's a really great answer and great overview of some of the complexities, but also huge importance of small-scale fisheries. And while we'll get into a little bit more of the topic of what sustainable and local means, I think what you've also identified, Elena, is that there's a huge human component to that. And so, Julie, I'm wondering, can you describe a little bit of the work that Fairtrade is doing to help support the sustainability of small-scale fisheries?
Sure. So we're the leading certifier of fair trade products in North America, and we certify fishers and the products that they harvest and process. And so with that, in 2014, we realized that the small scale fisher and fishery is being underserved by traditional certifications. And as Elena pointed out, we really wanted to take the fair trade model to address some of these issues that are occurring in global fisheries. So we work globally with fishermen and fishers, rather, to get them certified to our criteria, which includes social, economic, and environmental, I guess, bits in their criteria, essentially. So, the main thing I want to point out about the capture fisheries standard at Fair Trade is that we have this model of empowerment where for the sale of each pound of fair trade certified product generates what we call a community development fund. And these community development funds are aggregated and given back to the fishing communities or to the fishers that are working to meet the standard. And then they decide democratically how to spend those funds for the good of their communities, the fisheries, and the environment.
That's a great overview. And I think one of the topics that we would also love to hear a little bit more about is this concept of, okay, if not all small-scale fisheries are by nature sustainable, then there's a pathway for that. And Wendy, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about some of the work that you guys are doing to help support the sustainability of small-scale fisheries at World Wildlife Fund.
Sure, of course. Thanks, Megan. So yes, at WWF, we work in a few different ways. We work a lot on fishery improvement projects, or FIPs. And what fishery improvement projects are really projects where we work together with governments and fishermen and local NGOs, local scientists, and industry that are all involved in these fisheries, and we collaborate to try to improve the sustainability of these fisheries. So we work at all different levels and scales of fisheries, both small scale, artisanal, but also some larger scale fisheries as well. And we use this model to help improve the fisheries. So the goal of this FIP model is to eventually meet the Marine Stewardship Council standard. And the Marine Stewardship Council is one of the leading certification programs out there for wild-caught, responsibly managed fisheries. And we use that standard to really guide the process for how we need to improve fisheries on the ground. And so we follow their standard to improve the health of the stock, to minimize the ecosystem impacts of the fishery, and also to make sure that there are strong management practices in place. And so we do this again at all different scales. So for example, I personally work a lot with our Latin America programs and our offices down there. We have a couple of FIPs in Peru, for example. We work with mahi-mahi and with squid. And those fisheries are artisanal fisheries because they use very low technology with their gear, but they are fairly large. They span the entire country, and so there are actually over 4,000 vessels, although they are small vessels. And so we work with some specific communities, especially up in the north of Peru, to improve their management practices. And what we've been focusing on there is really improving their catch data so that they can make sure that they're collecting good catch data to help inform the stock assessment so that we know how healthy the stocks are. That's been some of our key focus there, as well as some traceability work to see where the fish is going. And then we're also working with a fishery in Chile on sardines. And this sardine fishery is actually used for aquaculture. It's one of the feed fisheries for aquaculture operations in Chile for salmon farms. And we want to ensure that even feed fisheries are sustainably managed. So we're working with that small scale fishery as well. WWF also has a coastal communities initiative where we work globally, and in Africa and Madagascar, we're actually working with a local NGO, Blue Ventures, to help connect fishing communities that are working on octopus and to try to help share lessons learned and improve their co-management practices as well. So we have lots of different initiatives around the world to help improve sustainability of fisheries.
I think that global context is really great. We're particularly excited about the work that is happening in Latin America, as well as the Caribbean Basin is an incredibly important region of the world to Iberostar. Felicity, I'm wondering, would you be willing to tell us some of the work that is going on in the Caribbean? Because I know the Caribbean is a particularly challenging place to be able to achieve fishery sustainability, or at least that's my assumption. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, I can actually speak to the work that we've been doing in the Caribbean and globally to address small-scale fisheries and making sure that our efforts are indeed directing to get sustainable fisheries. So the conservancies, for example, we've been using an innovative approach that's called FishPath that helps us to evaluate a country's fisheries management structure in order to determine the management gaps, and to identify several options that you can use to help move your fisheries towards sustainability. So in a nutshell, what FishPath does, it helps you to identify where you are in management, what are some of the issues that need to be addressed, provides you with potential avenues that you can take to get where you can be. And of course, this approach has been used in 13 countries across 5 continents. Now, the beauty of using FishPath is that it can be used in any country, even in countries where the fisheries is limited, which we know is a very big challenge, not just within the Caribbean, but also across many countries globally. We've also been promoting the onboard electronic monitoring and reporting with fishers that will be less costly, convenient, and user-friendly. And this is very important because we know many of the approaches that we take either are just too technical or too costly for the average small-scale fisher to be able to apply. But with the use of this approach, the data quality and consistency is improved. And of course, it provides more credible information to governments to help inform their management decisions. But specifically in the Caribbean, we've also been promoting sustainable fishing practices through our capacity building efforts. And here we've supported trainings with fishers to teach them how to use proper fishing methods, as well as safety at sea measures, data collection, and proper seafood handling to reduce contamination of the seafood product, and of course to avoid wastage of those products. So these are just some of the activities that we've been doing in the Conservancy to support small-scale fisheries, and not just within the Caribbean, but globally.
Thanks so much, Felicity. I think capacity building is one of the areas that means a lot. And Elena, I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit what that means and some of the work that Conservation International is also doing on small-scale fisheries. What is capacity building?
Very broad term, but that is part of our strategy. So briefly, at CI, we have a very strong coastal fisheries program comprising over 24 initiatives across 15 different countries, spanning the Americas, Africa, and Asia Pacific regions. And so our strategy for working in coastal fisheries combines transdisciplinary science with a really strong emphasis on social sciences and the integration of local stakeholder knowledge and values, governance reform, community capacity building, and market incentives to engender positive environmental, social, and economic change. So in a sense, I would say we engage in community capacity building through participatory methods, ensuring that local fishers and fishing communities are fully engaged and are leaders in the types of reform and interventions that take place. So similar to WWF, but slightly different, we use the Fishery Improvement Project model to drive improvements in small-scale fisheries. We've adapted this approach slightly to focus more on bottom-up efforts led by local stakeholders themselves. We use regional and domestic market leverage instead of export market leverage. And also important for us is the integration of social and economic dimensions for triple impact outcomes. And so we've achieved this through the development of the social responsibility assessment tool, which considers protection of human rights, dignity, and access to resources, ensuring equality and the equitable opportunity to benefit for all fishers and fish workers along the supply chain. And then finally, ensuring food and livelihood security, which, as I mentioned before, is a critical part of small-scale fisheries.
I think you guys have presented a number of really great guidelines and tools and pathways in order for small-scale fisheries to be able to achieve sustainability, not only for the fish populations, but also the people who depend on them. But I would imagine that adopting these things is not without some of its challenges. Wendy, maybe could you tell us a little bit on some of the problems or challenges that you've observed in a barrier to being able to enter into some of these pathways? Is it about data measurement? Is it about kind of just knowing what to do? What are some of the challenges that some of these small-scale fisheries face?
Yeah, I would say with a lot of these small-scale fisheries, I think some of the challenges are what you've mentioned, Megan. Really, the data collection challenges to begin with, and really having the information to know whether these communities are fishing sustainably, and being able to gather that data, know how to do it using scientific methods. Also, being able to monitor the data collection. So that's often a bit of a challenge for some of these smaller fishing communities. Also, just lack of knowledge on the impact of the fishery on the ecosystem and the surrounding habitat, and how can they measure to see what their impact is as well. And sometimes not having great management practices in place, or even knowing what are the best management practices to take. And so for a lot of these smaller communities, especially those that are very isolated, it's hard to know exactly what to do with these things. But I think one of the key things that helps with these issues is to have groups come in to work with these groups like we do, and a lot of these other NGOs do too as well. And helping them also to improve their organization as fishers, I think is a key first step. Sometimes these fishermen aren't organized into associations or cooperatives or things where they can work together as a group to improve the fisheries. So that's a great step to take as a first method, and then to start working together to improve some of these things.
That's a great overview of some of the challenges, but also some of the steps that can be taken towards that. I think that you guys have also demonstrated well that being able to opt into finding a pathway to reach sustainability is something that is important. But I'm curious a little bit more on the human side. And Julie, maybe you could tell us if there are any anecdotes from Fairtrade on how improving the environmental sustainability also improved the livelihoods of some of the communities that were using those resources.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's a key kind of hypothesis that we have, is that really improving the environmental sustainability will improve the social kind of conditions of people and communities. So we have a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence about how in Mexico, where we have several certified fisheries, they have been able to be Fairtrade certified, as well as Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch rated yellow. And then some of them have even gone on to, in Indonesia specifically, have gone on to receive MSC certification, Marine Stewardship Council certification, after working really hard to improve their organization and improve their, structural organization, as Wendy mentioned, and then improving their data collection, et cetera. And they've been able to actually achieve MSC. So how does this improve their social well-being? Well, as part of our program, like I mentioned, they receive these community development funds. And so working hard to ensure that their fisheries are working and that they're actually able to catch fish and bring it to a market that values what they're, the hard work that they're doing, and understands that it's not detrimental to the environment and to their communities and to the people if they're supporting this fish. That's a clear success in improving the social and the livelihoods of people on the ground that are actually working really hard to meet these standards, to participate in fishery improvement projects, whatever the tool that they're using. So there's definite clear anecdotal evidence and even like scientific and evidence that improving the environmental performance of fisheries really does have a significant kind of effect on social, viability and livelihoods in these small scale fisheries.
Felicity, I'm sure that you guys have a number of stories as well from the Nature Conservancy. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that, as well as thinking a little bit on some reasons on what might be barriers for these small scale fisheries to be able to achieve this sort of level of measurement and or certification.
Well, I think one thing that we need to remember that in some countries, poverty does exist, and many of the persons rely on these accessible resources like fisheries to either generate income or to provide food. And unfortunately, because of the critical need, many tend to engage in unsustainable fishing practices, whether it's capturing large volumes of juveniles, protected or threatened species, or fishing during the closed seasons, for example. And the only way, in the Caribbean, we've worked in places like Haiti and Dominican Republic, that we can seek to help alleviate those needs and to reduce the pressure on the marine resources, was to explore and introduce or offer to some of these communities alternative livelihood options that they can consider being more involved in order to support their families. I think this is a critical need. There are many things that we can do to move fisheries towards sustainability, but we really have to take into consideration those social, economic, and cultural conditions that exist as we work towards improving management. And as we talk about what may be some of the stumbling blocks that may impact small-scale fisheries or countries with regard to attaining sustainability certifications, is that, first of all, countries need to recognize that in order to attain and maintain these sustainability certifications requires sustainable funding, time, and commitment. This is not a process that is carried out lightly, and certifications are not achieved in 1 or 2 years. The process itself can be very lengthy, and the critical steps that need to be taken in order to meet those sustainability standards may require significant funding and even time to reach those sustainability objectives. Also, the key players that are involved in this process have to be fully committed and actively involved. If there is a lag in the process at any point, then more money and time has to be invested into keeping the momentum and making those advancements. And I think the greatest challenge is many of these countries, they hear about sustainability certifications and they're like, oh, this sounds great for us that we can do that. But they underestimate the amount of time, effort, and funding that goes into moving a fishery or fisheries towards meeting those sustainability certification standards. So I think those are very big issues that are going to impact the ability of countries being able to attain these sustainability certifications.
I think that's a great overview of the clear role that governments and the scientific community, as well as NGOs, can play, and funding agencies amongst that. Because this is also, and I think this is something that Iberostar is proud and excited to find ways that we can also support local fisheries in the places where we operate on our pathway to responsible consumption of seafood. But one of the other kind of components that we would love to bring along this journey is what our clients or what a general public can also do to better support local fisheries. And so, Wendy, I'm wondering if you have any advice on what an average consumer could do to support some of these issues, because I know these issues seem very large and perhaps outside of the scope of what you can do every day. But if you have any tips or advice, I think our viewers would love to hear that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'd say my first piece of advice is when you go to your seafood buyer to ask them where their products are coming from. The more people will ask, the more these buyers will realize that people are concerned about these issues and will start trying to source, hopefully, more from local products, local and sustainable products. So that's one thing. If you really want to get into details, you can also ask what gear type they use. And that's getting into more of the specifics. But just by asking those questions, I think would help a lot. Another thing too is to ask them to source from FIPS if they don't source from FIPS. In fact, just the word FIP, the acronym FIP, most seafood businesses out there know what that means now. And so and if they don't, you can teach them what it means and you can tell them what it means and they can look into it. And so I think that's a good way also to support these fisheries, because just by having these markets open and making sure that these fisheries that are actually spending all this time and effort and money, as Felicity is talking about, to really work on improvements, it does take a lot of effort. And so we want to make sure that they're getting rewarded for that by having a market for their products. And especially during this time of COVID, a lot of these smaller fishing communities really have been affected quite hard, unfortunately, because some of these smaller communities have only been selling to open air markets that now have to close because of health risks. And so they're looking for alternatives, and it's very difficult. So as much as we as consumers can support these small fishing communities by asking your buyers or your seafood counter, restaurant, whatever, to source from these local fisheries, I think that helps a lot.
I think that's a great overview of some steps that consumers can make, and we're looking forward tomorrow for our final conversation as this Riding the Wave series on what consumers can do to help with a commitment towards responsible seafood. So stay tuned for final discussion, and thank you so much to our panelists on a great first dip into what it is to support sustainability in small-scale fisheries. Thank you all so much.